Forward Towards Love. Chapter 1. Forward. Forward Towards Love is a project about arrivals. Every arrival begins with a departure. For some, like myself, the departure is predestined. I grew up in the 90s in Los Angeles as the child of two immigrants. My Korean mom lived in different parts of Europe for most of her life before settling in America. By the time she was 21, she could speak 12 different languages, reflecting a life having had arrived and departed on many occasions. On the other hand, my dad left a life of poverty in Hong Kong to find work in America and send money back to his family, which he did for years. He's never been back to Hong Kong since, and I can only help but think, because of the circumstances of his departure, the permanence of his arrival was that much more important. As the child of two immigrants, my life was always adapting. Between growing up surfing on the beaches of LA to coming home and eating Korean dumplings, while becoming fluent in Spanish in high school, and also having to wake up every Saturday and go to Chinese school to learn Mandarin. Although I had been born in California and never known another landscape, because my parents were immigrants, every day felt like arriving again. Cut to 16 years later, when the place where my parents once stood, I was now standing, having migrated myself to a new country, to a new city, and having to once again embark on the search for a sense of belonging. Chapter 2. Towards. Addressing immigration, or the departure and arrival from one home to another, and every feeling and emotion that story holds, for me and millions of other migrants around the world, is the question that has driven this architectural response. The architectural response to a question so complex and personal had to become more than the current matter-of-fact way of relating to immigrants. The response has to become more empathetic. In order to explore a more emotional architecture, the brief in this proposal uses fiction to engage with the deep complexities of real immigrants. Letters to Home was the first exploration of this fictional story. 6 fictional letters that describe the story of leaving Mexico and arriving to Scotland, while discussing how vivid memories of home and the writer's relationship to his lover are influencing the construction of his new home. To further structure fiction as a device for the design of architecture, I introduced 4 protagonists immigrating from 4 different places to the site in Scotland. The 4 characters represent the way globalization has impacted immigration in the world today. With advancements in the way that we travel, the migration of people has also advanced. Migration now takes place more than ever, and also for numerous different reasons that vary from cultural oppression to for a better life, to climatic disaster, to economic crisis. While the places and reasons that these migrants are coming from may vary, the thing that they share is to where they are arriving. In this brief, that place is located west of the city of Glasgow in Scotland, where if we follow the Scots Rail to its terminus at Gurrock and jump on a ferry crossing the mouth of the Firth of Clyde, we arrive at the town of Kilcreggan. Historically, in the 40s, the town played its part as an important naval town, sitting at the opening of the Clyde, where ships would pass to reach the port of Glasgow, and eventually the city of Glasgow. Zooming in, we can see the site's relationship to the town of Kilcreggan. Like many of the other towns that sit at the opening of the Clyde, Kilcreggan remained a small riverside community, largely occupied by agricultural lands that extend into the beginnings of the Scottish lowlands and highlands to the north. As a story, the architectural proposals is centered around the mutual relationship between the migrants and the Little Aden Road farm that owns the land that the migrants will build on. As a brief, the project uses the arrival to an agricultural plot to engage with an alternative to current modes of immigration that normally work in response to strong influxes to cities, where the architectural discussion and proposals are largely reactionary. This project diverges from that idea by creating a working relationship between the migrants and the farm they're arriving to. As the migrants add to the labor force on the farm, they are then offered a space on the farm's land that has become unoperational over time. In the traditional farm setting, land commonly loses its agricultural productiveness due to soil degradation, and while these lands are no longer farmable, they can become useful places for displaced people to land. My investigation into the site began with a technical study of the geological diversity of the richness of the Scottish lowlands and the architectural manipulations of resources from the land, resulting in a study that explores the materiality of stones, from traditional Scottish drywalling to contemporary methods of working with the material. Part of investigating the site, much like the brief, became personal. In one instance, I decided to actually enter into the picturesqueness I found in order to get to know the Clyde on a one-to-one scale, where all of its beauty and emotion are replaced by the reality of the cold and visceral experience of its waters. Chapter 3. Love. My approach to the project began with the idea of an architecture built upon love. I looked at love through a historical perspective, from Plato's Symposium on Platonic love to Rilke's psychological explanations through poetry, before moving on to how I thought love could be explained and understood. One of the exercises I gave myself was to draw by hand the plan of the house I grew up in order to better understand how memories could impact an architecture being imagined, drawn, or worked on today. And as I continued to address the story of the 4 protagonists in my brief, in addition to giving these characters names, places they're from, and life stories, I went further to imagine memories for them, and it was those memories and the architectural expression of those memories that eventually had the biggest impact in allowing the architecture of immigration to come together in a harmonious way with its site of landing. In the master plan, the coming together of these 4 migrants on a farm in Scotland can be seen sequentially. First is before. Before any new architecture, there is the expression of the land, which can be characterized through the dry stone walls that run through it, or the vein of the stream carrying water out towards the Clyde, not to mention areas of natural forestation providing an on-site resource for timber. Later comes arrival. The moment when these migrants are first landing on the site, they begin at first to build communal buildings like the shed and a water dwelling, and begin to create infrastructure to make it easier to arrive to the site by planning out some areas of land for tractors and trucks, and turning dry stone walls into roads. From one of the migrants' memories of walking the Mexican pyramids, where all paths for circulation are made from stones and mortar, as an example of how the memories of the immigrant was able to transform their place of landing by reimagining a wall that normally separates into a road that connects. Then comes community. Walls are coming up, initial shelters are being built, simple structures to start to actually be able to live on the land. And over time, the migrants are starting to form relationships with each other on the ground level. They're starting to engage with private versus public spaces, and spaces of comfort in a dialogue with man versus nature. The land is continuously changing in response to new architecture being built. Next is individuality, where cultural differences are beginning to show in the new architecture of each home. But still, there are moments where one house comes close to another and the beginning of a street is formed. The idea of permanence is being shown as buildings that were once primary structures upon arrival, where they once slept, are now becoming specialized buildings like altars and temples, because the migrants have now built more permanent homes. After comes settlement, where after having had lived in their new homes for some time, the architecture of these migrants extends past building just new homes. They're now starting to engage in sports and individual gardening and landscaping, even planning weddings in their backyard. And for all the timber that has been taken from the land, the residents are now able to strategically replant more trees in areas of new significance. And finally, future, where the story doesn't end with these 4 migrants, but continues as more people begin to arrive to the site and begin again the process of landing in a new place after being displaced. The construction of these homes represents another form of the adaptation of multiple influences coming together. While they're insulated with straw bale coming from the host farm, they also utilize a traditional material characteristic of vernacular Scottish architecture, stone, to protect the interior timber framework and insulation from the Scottish climate. The project does not propose a self-built community. It suggests that we take a critical look at the degrees of authorship that we as architects hold in a project versus the agency of the resident, and the proposed change to the current linear relationship of an architect willing to step back in order to let the direct effect of the engagement between semi-skilled residents and local and traditional experts to take place, in turn indirectly allowing architecture to manifest as the architect provides a set of rules and tools to guide the project. The result is collaboration. I chose to take 2 of the protagonist homes into further detail as examples of how this type of architecture can manifest and begin to coexist within a community. First is Miguel Sanchez. He comes from Mexico City and is an artist and writer. He's married to Leonora Gonzalez, and they moved to Scotland to provide a better life for his future family. The Gonzalez Sanchez house comes from Miguel Sanchez's memory of Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo's house in Mexico City, which took the intense relationship of Rivera and Kahlo and expressed this architecturally between 2 individual volumes connected by an outdoor bridge. The Gonzalez Sanchez house takes this idea and seeks to transplant the same programmatic organization of that house into the Scottish climate, where an outdoor bridge is not necessarily possible. On the ground floor plan, one can see that at the main entrance, the house splits into 2 separate living spaces. The outdoor bridge that could not exist in the northern climate of Scotland now exists as an interior space that both connects and separates the Sanchez living space from the Gonzalez living space. On the first floor, differences in their personalities can be seen through the architecture. While the Sanchez living space is laid out in an open plan, sleeping working space, the Gonzalez living space is more traditional closed-off spaces. And while we see how the 2 living spaces are separated, we can see subtle moments of reconnection, like this interior window opening up into a double height above the kitchen on the ground floor, or in adjacent small balconies, allowing for small moments of intimacy. The section shows how the house sits in the land and how the straw bale insulation is capped by an exterior stone wall and breathable lime wash finish. Here, the interior window to double height moment leading into the kitchen on the ground level is also expressed. The second character I went further into detail with was Abdul Qadri, who's from Cairo, Egypt. He's coming from a family of generations of agricultural workers. Him and his son moved to Scotland after his crops dried up from climate change. The Qadri house takes on the memories of Abdul from living in informal housing structures in between the high-rises of Cairo and the fertile lands of the Nile Delta. While the interior spatial experience of these houses are usually geometric and full of movement, in Cairo they're normally expressed upwards in a squared-off vertical typology due to urban density. The Qadri house takes the memory of the interior spatial experience experience of these homes and implements it in the Scottish lowlands without the need to build upwards, allowing the house to leave its geometric forms as they are and connect with the land horizontally. In the ground floor plan of the Cadre house, we can see how time has influenced the home. While the first part of the home is built with the same brickwork techniques as the informal Cairo home, later parts of the home are built with a technique that has been adapted from living on site for more time. The first floor plan shows how the outdoor plinths are covered with roofs to protect from the northern climate, and movement is constantly being expressed through transitional living spaces and the orientation of rooms in relation to each other. In section, the vertical movement of the house can also be seen, as it reflects the influence of the existing terrain on the building. Because movements of circulation make up a lot of the house, strategically placed windows are used to bring importance to them. In the ground floor hallway, as the floor plate terraces with the land, the space opens up vertically, and a window is placed just above eye level in order to emphasize the vertical move with light. The project led to interesting comparisons between differences within the architectural languages of other cultures. The Gonzalez Sanchez house represents the way Mexican homes are painted with vibrant colors on their outside, while the interiors are normally left white in order to reflect the vibrancy of the objects of the Mexican home, the textiles, the ceramics, the plants, all of the objects that end up reflecting colors onto white walls. This juxtaposes the informal Cairo homes completely, as their exteriors are normally a neutral red color due to the bricks being from the dirt around the Nile, while the inside is where the home is painted vibrant colors in order to express individuality. As expressed through these interior views, the uniqueness of each house impacts the experience of looking from one house to another, and the parallels and differences of people coming from opposite ends of the world start to come back from architecture into the lives of people, so that they might get to live their love story to the fullest, so that they might look outside and dare to let their imaginations run wild, so that in the end, if we must depart, and we know we must eventually arrive, that the direction that we go in is forward towards love and forward towards home.